She rode to a stranger's door with nothing but a name, a cracked leather satchel, and a proposal no decent woman should have to make. Evelyn Ashcroft had survived a dead harvest, a landlord's boot, and a Montana winter that killed 3 men stronger than her. But she would not survive another night in that cold. So she made a choice. Not a good one. Not a proud one. The kind of choice you make when survival strips away everything except the raw, ugly truth. Beg or die. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Silas Granger had been waiting for exactly this moment for 9 years. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The horse nearly gave out on her 3 miles before she reached the ranch. Evelyn felt it in the animal's gait. That subtle, desperate shortening of stride. The way its breathing changed from rhythm to labor. She loosened the reins and leaned forward, pressing one gloved hand against the mare's neck. The coat was damp despite the cold, and beneath her palm, Evelyn could feel the tremble that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Come on, Nettie," she said quietly. "Just a little more." The words came out steadier than she felt. Around her, the Montana Valley had gone white and gray and white again. Snow packed over frozen ground, dead grass jutting up through the crust in brittle yellow clumps, the sky the color of dirty wool pressing low against the ridgeline. It was the kind of landscape that didn't try to be beautiful. It just was what it was, hard, honest, and completely indifferent to whether you made it through or not. Evelyn had grown up in country like this. She knew better than to fight it. What she hadn't known, or hadn't wanted to admit until 3 days ago, was that she'd finally run out of ways to outlast it. The room she'd rented from Mabel Fitch on the east edge of Cutler's Creek, $2 a month, shared woodpile. No visitors after dark, had been warm enough, barely. She'd lived there 4 years, long enough that the crooked window frame felt like hers, long enough that the draft under the door was a thing she'd learned to manage with a folded flour sack, long enough that she'd stopped thinking of it as temporary. Then Mabel's son-in-law arrived from Billings with money and opinions, and by Tuesday, Evelyn was standing in the road with her satchel in her hand and nowhere left to go. She'd spent 2 nights in the livery which the owner, Walt Pearson, pretended not to notice. On the 3rd morning, he'd found a reason to need the space. She understood. She didn't blame him. That didn't make it easier to saddle Nettie and ride out of Cutler's Creek in the dark before anyone was awake to see it. The cold had its teeth in her by the time the Iron Hollow fence line appeared through the snow haze, weathered posts and wire that seemed to run on for longer than it should, marking off land that didn't announce itself the way some ranches did. No painted sign, no grand gate, just fence, then more fence, then eventually a lane of packed dirt leading toward a cluster of dark shapes she recognized from a distance as buildings. She'd been to Iron Hollow once before, 7 years ago, with her father. She remembered very little of that visit. A wide porch, the smell of wood smoke. A man her father spoke to in low, even tones. She'd waited by the wagon and looked at the mountains. Now she was the one who needed something. Nettie made it to the yard at a walk. Evelyn didn't push her. She stepped down from the saddle beside a water trough that had a thin skim of ice across the top, looped the reins over a post, and stood for a moment with her hands pressed flat against her thighs. She wasn't sure if she was trying to warm her palms or steady her nerves. Probably both. The house was larger than she'd remembered. 2 stories, with the upper half sided in dark wood that had weathered to the color of charcoal. A lamp burned in the front window. Smoke came straight up from the chimney, barely bending in the air. Barely any wind today, which was its own kind of strange for this time of year in the valley. She walked to the door and knocked, 3 times. Not too hard, not soft enough to ignore. She heard movement inside. Not rushed, not startled, the kind of movement that belonged to a person who was already awake and already somewhere near the door. The latch lifted and the door swung inward, and Silas Granger stood in the frame looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. He was taller than she'd expected. She didn't know why that surprised her. Maybe because she'd built him into something more abstract during the long ride out, a possibility, a destination. And real people had a way of being more specific than you planned for. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in 4 or 5 days, and eyes that were a particular shade of brown that made her think of river water in October. Clear, but not bright. Still, but not empty. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has to make a decision about. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. Not a question. Not quite a greeting either. That stopped her. She'd been bracing for the usual sequence. "Can I help you? What brings you out here? Do we know each other?" The small social machinery that gave a person a moment to collect themselves before the real conversation started. He'd skipped all of it. "You know who I am," she said. "Your father brought you here once. You were maybe 16. He stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly, but not a barrier either. "Come inside before you freeze." She went in. The front room was warmer than she'd expected and plainer than most. A stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, burning low but steady. A table with 2 chairs, a shelf of tools and books mixed together without particular order, a bridle hanging on the same peg as a hammer, a copy of something she couldn't read the spine of leaning against a tin coffee pot, a rug on the floor that had once been patterned and was now worn down to suggestion. It wasn't comfortable exactly, it was functional. She found that easier to be inside than a room that was trying to be something. Silas moved to the fireplace and fed it another piece of wood without asking if she wanted more heat. She was grateful for that. She was tired of being asked about her comfort by people who weren't actually prepared to do anything about it. "You want coffee?" he said. Again, not a question. Yes. He went to the kitchen. She heard the sound of a pot being set on iron, water being poured. She stood near the fire and let the warmth work into her hands and her face, and she thought about what she was going to say and how she was going to say it, and she realized that all the speeches she'd composed on the ride out here had evaporated somewhere around the 2nd mile, and now she had nothing. Fine. She'd say it plain. He came back with 2 cups, handed her one, and sat down in one of the chairs by the table. He didn't sit like a man waiting for her to perform. He sat like a man who had a few minutes and nothing urgent to do with them. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth moved through the ceramic and into her palms, and she breathed out slowly. "I need to propose something to you," she said. "All right. I lost my room 3 days ago. The Fitch place in town. Her son-in-law took it back." She kept her voice level. She'd had time to make peace with the facts, if not with the shape of them. "I spent 2 nights in Walt Pearson's livery before he needed it. I have—" She paused, because this was the part that still felt like a physical thing, a bruise she kept pressing. "I have $41, a horse, the clothes I'm wearing, and a few things in that satchel. And I have skills. I can sew, I can keep accounts, I can cook well enough to keep a person alive and better than that on a good day, and I know livestock." Silas nodded once, slowly, watching her. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm asking for a transaction. I'll work this ranch, whatever you need, and in exchange I need a roof and enough food to get through the winter." She stopped, then, because she'd already come this far, and there wasn't much left to lose. "And I think the most honest way to do that, the way that protects us both from what people will say, is if we get married." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. That was the first thing she noticed. He wasn't startled. He wasn't offended. He wasn't scrambling through social rules trying to figure out how to respond. He was just sitting there with his coffee, looking at her with that particular kind of stillness that she was starting to realize might just be who he was. "I know that's not—" she started. "Yes," he said. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Yes, I'll marry you." She'd prepared for argument. She'd prepared for negotiation, for conditions, for a polite refusal that she'd have to find a way to respond to without falling apart. She had not prepared for that. "You should know what you're agreeing to," she said carefully. "I do." "I'm not—" She set her cup down on the mantel and turned to face him more fully. "Mr. Granger, I'm offering a practical arrangement. I'm not offering anything else. I want that to be clear between us from the start." "It's clear," he said. "Same on my end." She studied him for a long moment, looking for something she could identify as a catch, a motive, an angle she'd missed. She didn't find one, which didn't mean it wasn't there. She'd learned that lesson young, but it wasn't visible. "You don't have questions," she said. "I have plenty." He stood up and brought his cup to the kitchen. When he came back, he was pulling on a coat. "But they'll keep. Right now your horse needs water and feed." She watched him walk to the door and take his hat from a hook. He stopped with his hand on the latch. "The room at the top of the stairs is yours," he said. "Was the guest room. You can look it over, see if there's anything you need that isn't there." Then he went outside. She stood in the warm room with her hands wrapped around her cooling coffee and thought, he said was the guest room, not his. She found the stairs without any trouble and stood at the top for a moment in the narrow hallway before opening the door. The room was not what she expected. It was not grand. Nothing about this house was grand, but it was arranged. That was the word she kept coming back to, standing in the doorway. Arranged. As though someone had given thought to where things went and why and for whom. The bed had a proper quilt on it, not a rough blanket. Not new. She could see the wear in the seams, but clean and carefully folded back at one corner as though someone had placed it that way deliberately. There was a small desk beneath the window, and on the desk were 2 candles and a holder, a decent lamp, and a tin cup that held. She moved closer and looked into the cup. Needles. Thread in 4 colors. A small pair of scissors with bone handles. She set her palm flat on the desk and stood very still for a moment. Sewing supplies. Good ones. The kind of quality she would have chosen herself. Not left from some previous occupant. She could see that the thread was wound on fresh spools, unbroken, clean at the cut ends. Someone had put these here deliberately. She opened the small wardrobe in the corner. It was mostly empty, but on the top shelf, folded with care, was a length of good wool fabric, dark blue, the kind that kept out wind, and beside it a paper of pins. She closed the wardrobe door very slowly. She crossed to the window and looked out. Below, she could see Silas leading Nettie into the barn, one hand on the bridle, the mare walking without any fuss. He moved without hurry, without waste, a man who was comfortable doing what he was doing. She turned the room over in her mind the way you turn a stone over looking for what's underneath. The sewing supplies were specific, not an accident, not a coincidence, not some leftover from a previous woman in this house. She'd been listening to herself think that last sentence, and she made herself stop and look at it plainly. There had been a woman here at some point, probably. Silas was 40, maybe more, and he'd built something from this land. A life had happened here. But those needles were new. Those spools were new. The fabric on the shelf was still sharp at the fold, the way new cloth was before it had been handled. She sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands between her knees and breathed. She was tired. She was colder than she'd realized until now that she was starting to warm up, and that specific exhaustion of fear that has been performing as strength for 3 days was finally beginning to dissolve. Her eyes stung with it. She did not cry. She hadn't let herself do that yet, and she didn't see a reason to start. But she sat there in that arranged room with its new needles and its good quilt and its lamp turned just so, and she thought, somebody expected something. They were married 6 days later. The justice of the peace came from Dillon, a small man named Gerald Hatch, who seemed mildly confused by the whole arrangement, but was professional enough to proceed without comment. 2 of Silas's ranch hands, a man named Roy Dupree and a young one everyone called Cricket because no one seemed to know his real name, stood as witnesses. Roy was weathered and quiet and shook Evelyn's hand afterward with the kind of care that suggested he'd been told to be respectful and was genuinely trying. Cricket just nodded at her from under a hat that was 2 sizes too big and looked relieved when the whole ceremony was over. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Gerald Hatch had a copy of the words memorized to the point that they'd become smooth and featureless from use. He said them. Silas and Evelyn each said what they were supposed to say. The papers were signed. Gerald Hatch was back in his buggy and heading down the lane before the snow started again. Roy and Cricket found things to do in the barn. Silas and Evelyn stood on the porch for a moment in the gray light. "I'll start with the accounts tomorrow," she said. "Roy mentioned the winter feed records are a mess." "They are," Silas agreed. "All right." She turned toward the door. "I can have supper on in an hour." "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. And she meant it in a practical way, and she also meant it in the way that said, "I need to do something useful right now, and I need you to let me." He must have heard both meanings, because he just nodded and went to the barn. The routine came faster than she expected. She had always been a person who operated best inside structure, not structure imposed from outside, but the kind she built herself, the arrangement of her own day into something with a shape. She'd done it in her rented room, managing her time around the few jobs she was able to pick up in town. Here, on a working ranch in the belly of winter, there was no shortage of structure. There was only the question of how to find her place inside it. She made breakfast before full light. She and Silas ate largely in silence, which did not feel unfriendly, just honest. There was something between them that had not been named yet, and she was in no hurry to name it. They moved around each other in the kitchen with a surprising lack of collision, and she wasn't sure what to make of that either. She took over the accounts on the second day. The winter feed records were, as Roy had said, a mess. Not because Silas was careless, she came to understand, but because he'd been doing them himself between everything else, and there simply hadn't been time. She sat at the desk in the front room with the ledgers spread open and 3 different sets of receipts in 3 different handwritings, and she worked through it methodically, the way she always worked. Start at the beginning, follow each thread. Don't move forward until the previous thing was settled. On the 4th day, she found a discrepancy. Not large. $18 over 6 months, feed weights that didn't match the supplier invoices. She brought it to Silas at lunch. "This here," she said, setting the open ledger on the table and pointing to the column. "The September delivery. Your receipt says 42 bushels, but the feed supplier's copy says 38. Silas looked at the numbers, then looked at her. "You found that in 4 days." "I was looking." He was quiet for a moment. "That supplier's been shorting me for 2 years. I knew the numbers weren't right, but I couldn't find where." She tapped the column. 4 more deliveries with the same gap. I'll have the full number by tonight." "All right." He folded his hands on the table. "What do you suggest we do about it?" She looked at him. He was asking her. Not as a courtesy. Actually asking. "Write to the supply company in Dillon," she said. "Not the local dealer, the company directly. Send the comparison receipts. Ask for a written explanation. Give them 2 weeks. And if they don't respond? Then we go to the county office and file a complaint. It's not enough money for a lawyer, but a formal complaint on record costs them more than just paying you back." She paused. "Do you have copies of all the delivery receipts?" "In the barn. Back of the tack room, in a box." "I'll need them." He stood up. "I'll get them." That evening, she sat with the full collection spread out on the table and worked through each one. Silas came in from the cold around 7, stomped snow off his boots at the door, and looked over at her without saying anything. $63 over 2 years, she said without looking up. 14 separate deliveries. The silence from across the room had a particular quality to it. "I'll write the letter in the morning," she said. "If you want to review it first." "No," he said. "I trust your judgment on it." She looked up then, because it was the kind of sentence that could mean different things depending on the person saying it. There was no particular softness in his face. He wasn't performing gratitude. He was just saying a thing that he meant. She looked back at her papers. "All right," she said. "Supper in 30 minutes." The town was the problem she'd known it would be. She'd had 3 weeks of relative peace. The blizzard that came in hard on the 4th day of her marriage had kept everyone close to home, and she was grateful for that in the way that people are grateful for a delay they know is only a delay. But when the first real break in the weather came and she rode into Cutler's Creek with Silas to collect mail and supplies, the town was waiting, not overtly. Nothing as honest as open hostility. What she got instead was the particular social cruelty of people who had already decided what you were and were merely performing the inconvenience of having to see you. The dry goods store was the worst of it. A woman named Patricia Holt, who had a husband with a small but profitable lumber operation and therefore considered herself the center of certain social arrangements in Cutler's Creek, was already at the counter when Evelyn walked in. Patricia had 2 other women with her. Evelyn recognized one of them, Clara Beach, who had been passingly friendly to her in the years when Evelyn lived in town. The other she didn't know. Patricia turned when the door opened, looked at Evelyn with an expression of bright, particular neutrality, and said, "Mrs. Granger? My goodness, we were just talking about you." The way she said it made it absolutely clear that this was not a pleasant coincidence. "Mrs. Holt," Evelyn said, "we were saying how remarkable it was, that you'd had the—" She searched the ceiling briefly, the performance of a woman choosing her words with great delicacy. The resourcefulness to find such a situation, just before winter, too. Clara Beach looked at the floor. The woman Evelyn didn't know made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I'm looking for the cambric thread. Evelyn said to the man behind the counter. "And a spool of the number 8 waxed linen if you have it." "Of course." He turned to find it, and Evelyn moved to the counter, turning her back to Patricia Holt by accident or design. It didn't matter which, the effect was the same. "I do hope," Patricia continued, to no one in particular, "that poor Mr. Granger knows what he's gotten himself into. Taking in a woman with nothing, no family, no—" "He knows exactly what he's gotten himself into," Evelyn said, without turning around. Her voice was even. She'd practiced being even in situations like this for most of her adult life. "He married me." A small silence. "Of course," Patricia said. "Of course he did." The thread was placed on the counter. Evelyn paid for it. She thanked the man behind the counter, who looked slightly pained, and she walked back out into the cold. She sat in the wagon and stared at the horse's ears for 30 seconds before Silas came out of the post office across the street and walked over. He climbed up beside her without asking how the store had been, and she was grateful for that too. "Mail?" she said. "Letter from the feed supplier in Dillon." He handed it to her. She opened it, read it quickly. "They're disputing 4 of the 14 deliveries. The rest they're willing to correct." She folded it. "That's still $41. Better than nothing. I'll write back tonight. They'll fold on the other 4. She tucked the letter into her coat. "They know you have documentation." He clicked at the horse and they moved out of town, and she watched the buildings shrink behind them, and she breathed out through her nose and let the cold air do what it did. He didn't ask. She didn't tell him. She thought about Patricia Holt, about the particular artistry of that kind of cruelty, the plausible deniability of it, the way it left no mark you could point to. And she decided it wasn't worth the energy of anger. She'd made her peace with invisible people a long time ago. She just hadn't expected to be one again. Correct. It was Roy Dupree who said the thing that cracked something open. He came to find her in the barn in the 2nd month, looking for a piece of leather to patch a broken harness. And while she was helping him sort through the supply box, he said, in the sideways manner of a man who'd been thinking about whether to say something for a while, "You know he fixed up that room about 8 months ago." She kept her hands busy in the box. "What room?" "The one you're in." "The guest room." Roy was looking at the harness, not her. "Bought new ticking for the mattress. Had Cricket repaint the window frame. I remember because we thought he was expecting family." Evelyn stood up slowly. "No family came," Roy continued. "We figured he'd changed his mind about whoever it was, but he kept everything in there just the way he'd done it." He glanced at her sideways. "Anyway, I found my leather, I think." He held up a strip of dark cowhide and went back to the barn without further comment. Evelyn stood with her hands at her sides. 8 months ago. She'd still been in her room at Mabel Fitch's house 8 months ago. She'd had no contact with Silas Granger. She hadn't spoken his name in 7 years, not since her father mentioned in passing that the Granger ranch out in Iron Hollow was doing well. The mattress ticking, the window frame, the needles and thread and the bolt of blue wool on the shelf. 8 months ago. She went back to the house and stood in the kitchen, looking at the kettle on the stove, and tried to build an explanation that wasn't the obvious one. Maybe he'd been expecting someone else, a cousin, a friend. Maybe the room had been done before and she was misremembering it as new. Maybe Roy had the timing wrong. She went upstairs and opened the wardrobe and took the blue wool off the shelf and examined the selvage edge. Uncut, unhandled, the fold creases still sharp from the mill. She put it back carefully and stood in the room for a long moment. Her name had been in this room before she arrived. She didn't know how she knew that. She just did. Winter had its second opinion about spring the way Montana winter always did. Just when you thought you'd made it threw another week at you. The snow that came in the 3rd month was wetter and meaner than the December storms, the kind of wet cold that got into everything, and Evelyn spent 3 days essentially confined to the house by weather serious enough that even the ranch hands were staying close. She was useful. She was always useful. She went through every cabinet and corner she could find, organizing, inventorying, noting what needed to be replaced and what needed to be repaired and what could wait. She was good at seeing what was actually there rather than what she expected or hoped to see. It was a skill she'd developed young and relied on ever since. It was on the second confined day that she noticed the barn. Not the main barn. She'd been in and out of that every day. The smaller one, further back on the property, past the woodpile and the second corral. She'd registered it as a storage structure, probably for equipment, and hadn't given it particular attention. But looking out the kitchen window that morning, she noticed the door was secured differently than you'd secure an empty building. A proper iron padlock, not a simple latch. She kept that to herself. On the third day, when the snow eased to something manageable, she layered up and went out to look. The padlock was good quality. Not Silas being secretive for the sake of it, but something valuable enough to lock. She didn't touch it. She walked the perimeter of the building instead, stepping through the crusted snow, looking at the structure itself. It was older than the main buildings. The boards had a different weathering pattern, and the corner beams were the kind of heavy, square-cut timber that spoke to an earlier era of construction, before the sawmill in Dillon opened and changed the way lumber was handled in the valley. One of the side walls had a window that had been boarded over from the inside. She stood in front of it for a long time. She was not a dramatic person. She did not imagine things without evidence. She kept herself, as a rule, in the company of facts and left speculation for people who had the luxury of being wrong. But she had evidence. She had the room upstairs with its new ticking and its unworn wool and its precisely chosen sewing supplies. She had Roy's offhand timing. She had the particular quality of Silas's yes, too quick, too certain, too unsurprised, when she'd made her proposal at his door. And she had a padlocked barn that was secured like something inside it needed protecting. She stood in the cold outside that boarded window for a long time, long enough that her toes went numb inside her boots, and she thought, who's been keeping a secret in this place? And for how long? And what does it mean that I am here? She didn't have answers yet. She went back inside and made supper and sat across from Silas at the table and passed the salt when he needed it, and didn't say a word about any of it. But that night, lying in the room that had been prepared for her before she existed as a possibility in this house, she stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who said yes without hesitating, who knew her name without being told, who arranged a room for a woman who hadn't asked and hadn't come. Not yet. The snow fell outside the window, patient and quiet, covering everything. And somewhere on this ranch, behind a padlocked door, whatever he'd been keeping safe was still keeping. She would find it. Not yet. Not while the ground was frozen and the questions weren't organized enough to follow. But she would find it, and nothing would be the same after. The tea was the thing that finally made her say something out loud. She'd been cataloging the small impossibilities for weeks by then. The way Silas always left the kitchen lamp turned low instead of out when he went to bed before her, because she worked late and preferred to find the room already lit rather than fumble in the dark. The way the firewood box was always full on the mornings she'd planned to refill it herself, as though he'd checked it in the night and taken care of it without comment. Small things. The kind of things that could each be explained away individually, and so she had explained them away, one at a time, until the pile of explanations got heavy enough that she couldn't carry it anymore. The tea was chamomile. She hadn't bought it. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. But it appeared on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet one Thursday morning, a small cloth bag of dried chamomile, tied with kitchen twine, placed exactly where she would have placed it if she'd put it there herself. She stood in front of the open cabinet for a long time. Silas was already outside when she came to find him. He was mending a section of fence near the second corral, crouched down with a pair of pliers and a length of wire, the kind of work that didn't require your full attention and so left room for conversation. She stopped a few feet away. "The chamomile in the cabinet," she said. He didn't look up right away. He finished the twist of wire, and then he straightened and turned to look at her. His expression was the same as it always was. Not blank, not unreadable, just settled. Like a man who had made peace with whatever was going on inside him and wasn't trying to hide the fact that something was there. "Roy's wife sells them in town," he said. "Dried herbs. She does a good business with them in winter." "I didn't ask you for it." "No. I never told you I drank chamomile." A pause. Not long. "No," he said again. She looked at him steadily. "Then how did you know?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't avoiding the question, but was deciding how to answer it honestly. He turned back to the fence and crouched again, fitting the pliers to the next section. "You used to buy it from Mrs. Alderman's shop," he said. "On Thursdays, whenever she had it in stock." Evelyn did not move. "You watched me shop." I was in town most Thursdays. He wasn't looking at her. I wasn't watching. I just noticed. She stood in the cold outside that fence for a long moment, feeling the particular sensation of a floor shifting under her feet in a room she'd thought was solid. She was not a woman who fell apart in front of other people. She never had been. But she felt something move through her that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. It was something closer to the feeling of realizing a map you'd been using was drawn wrong, and now you had to figure out where you actually were. For how long, she said. He looked up at her then. A while. That's not an answer. He held her gaze. I know. She waited. He didn't add anything else. She turned and walked back to the house, and she heard the pliers working behind her, steady and quiet, as if nothing had happened. But she knew something had happened. She just didn't have the shape of it yet. She threw herself into the work with a particular kind of focus after that. The way she always managed things that were too tangled to address directly, she got busy. There was no shortage of things to be busy with. The feed supplier and Dylan had finally capitulated on the remaining disputed deliveries, and she spent an afternoon drafting a response that was formal and precise and left no room for further argument. When the corrected payment arrived, all $63 of it, she noted it in the ledger without ceremony. But Roy came in from outside that afternoon and found her at the table and said, "Heard Dylan paid out." And she said, "They did." And he said, "Good." And that was the whole of it, which she found satisfying in a way that a larger celebration would not have been. She started keeping her own set of notes, not the official ranch ledger, but a personal record. She was organized by nature and disliked having things exist only in her head. She wrote down what she knew, what she'd observed, what she couldn't yet explain. The chamomile, the room, Roy's 8-month timeline, the locked barn. Silas's yes at the door, too quick, too ready. Written down, the list was harder to minimize. She was not ready to confront it directly. Not because she was afraid exactly. She'd sat across from enough difficult truths in her life to know that avoiding them only gave them more room to grow. But she didn't have enough yet. She had fragments. And she'd learned the hard way that confronting someone with fragments just gave them room to fill the gaps in whatever direction suited them. She needed the rest of the picture first. What she got instead, before she was ready for it, was an afternoon with Margaret Crane. Margaret was the wife of Silas's nearest neighbor, Tom Crane, who ran a smaller cattle operation about 4 miles east and who had the air of a man who was content with what he had. Margaret had come by with a jar of pickled beets and an obvious agenda, which Evelyn respected on both counts. She was in her mid-50s, stout and sharp-eyed, and direct in the way of women who'd spent too much of their life being indirect and had given it up as a bad investment. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Margaret talked about the winter and the Crane cattle and the roof of the church hall that had been needing repairs since October. And Evelyn listened and responded and waited, because she could feel the actual conversation gathering itself just behind the social one. It arrived on the 3rd cup. "You know," Margaret said, turning her cup in her hands, "Tom and I weren't sure what to make of it when we heard. You and Silas." She glanced up. "No offense meant. None taken. It just seemed quick." She paused. "Tom said maybe Silas finally did what he'd been putting off. I didn't know what he meant by that." Evelyn kept her voice easy. "What did Tom say when you asked?" "He said Silas had been talking about that guest room since last spring, wanting to get it put right." Margaret's expression was thoughtful, almost puzzled, like a woman holding a piece of a puzzle she hadn't decided where to place yet. "Tom thought he was expecting someone. Family, maybe. But Silas never had much family. And then no one came, and the room just sat there, all fixed up. Last spring. Not 8 months ago. Last spring was closer to 10. Evelyn kept her face still. "He never mentioned anyone to you?" "No." Margaret picked up her cup. "Silas doesn't say much that isn't necessary. I expect you've noticed." "I've noticed." Margaret looked at her over the rim of her coffee with that sharp, steady gaze that didn't miss much. "Are you all right? Here, I mean, is everything—" "Everything is fine," Evelyn said. And then, because Margaret deserved something more honest than a social answer, "He's a decent man, a quiet one, but decent." Margaret nodded slowly, as though filing that away. "Good," she said. "That's good." After she left, Evelyn sat at the table with the jar of pickled beets in front of her and thought, 10 months. Silas had been fixing up that room 10 months before she arrived at his door. Longer than Roy had said, longer than she'd been calculating. 10 months ago, she'd been in her rented room in town, working alterations for Mrs. Lindquist and keeping her head down and not thinking about the future, because thinking about the future was a luxury she couldn't quite afford. Silas Granger had been buying mattress ticking and chamomile tea and blue wool. For her. She didn't know how she knew it was for her. She knew it the way you know certain things. Not from evidence alone, but from the way the evidence sat in your chest when you held it there. She'd been wrong about things before. She could be wrong about this. But she didn't think she was. The question that followed was larger and harder, and she turned it over slowly. Why? Not in a frightened way. She'd looked at Silas Granger enough by now to know the shape of him, the way he moved through a day, the way he spoke to Roy and Cricket with a plainness that wasn't unkind, the way he never once in 2 months had made her feel like something owed to him. There was nothing in him that set off the kind of alarm she'd learned to trust. He was a private person with a long patience and a tendency to say less than he could have. But he was keeping something. The barn was still locked. The full story was still somewhere she couldn't reach. And 10 months was a long time to carry something quietly. She was in the barn with Nettie on an afternoon in late February when Cricket wandered in looking for a lead rope and instead found her replacing a worn stitching on the mare's saddle girth. He was 19 or 20. She'd never gotten a clear answer. And he had the quality of a person who said things without first running them through a social filter, which she found simultaneously exhausting and useful. He found his lead rope and was almost back out the door when he stopped and said, without turning around, he used to ride past your place in town sometimes, at night mostly. Evelyn kept her hands on the leather. My place. The Fitch house, on the east side. Cricket still wasn't looking at her. He was examining the lead rope with the concentration of a man who had suddenly found it very interesting. Not weird about it, just slow past, a few times a year. Did you ride with him? Once. I asked him what we were doing, and he said checking the road. The road was fine. Cricket finally looked up, and his face had the expression of a young person who had said a true thing and wasn't entirely sure whether he was glad he'd said it. Anyway, he went out. Evelyn sat with the saddle girth in her hands and the needle threaded and her mind doing something complicated behind her steady expression. She wasn't sure what she felt. Not frightened, she'd examined that possibility and it didn't fit. Silas was not a man who rode past her window out of possession or fixation. She couldn't have said exactly how she knew the difference, except that she did. The way you knew the difference between the sound of wind in a tree and the sound of something else moving through it. What she felt, sitting there in the barn with the cold coming in under the door and Nettie warm and patient beside her, was something she hadn't expected. She felt like she'd been seen. Not watched, seen. From a careful, respectful distance, by someone who wanted nothing from her except for her to be all right. That was the strangest part. The part she couldn't fit into any category she had. So, the town made its second opinion known the following week, in the form of a conversation she was not supposed to hear. She was at the back of the hardware store. Silas had sent her for a specific size of bolt, and the owner had gone to look in the storeroom, when 2 women came in talking at the volume of people who believed the store was empty. She recognized Patricia Holt's voice immediately. You'd think she'd have the decency to be a little humble about it, Patricia was saying, walking around like she belongs, like she didn't ride out there and convince a lonely man. I heard she organized all his accounts, the other woman said. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite conviction. Roy Dupree said she saved him $60 with the feed supplier. Roy Dupree would say anything to anyone. That doesn't mean the woman isn't there for the money. Patricia's voice tightened with the particular quality of someone who had made a decision about a person and found counter-evidence annoying. Silas has that land. That's real money. That land. And she had nothing. She had skills. She had desperation. There's a difference. Evelyn stood very still in the back of the store. The bolt she needed was in her hand. She kept her breathing even and quiet. I just don't think we know the whole story, the other woman said, with the slightly helpless tone of someone losing an argument they'd never wanted to have. We know enough, Patricia said. The store owner came back from the storeroom then, and the conversation shifted, and Evelyn walked to the front counter and paid for her bolt and said thank you and went out to the street. She sat in the wagon and let herself feel it for exactly the length of time it took to breathe in and breathe out twice. Then she put it away. She had work to do. What she hadn't put away, what she couldn't, was the locked barn. She thought about it the way you think about a splinter you can't reach. Mostly, it didn't interfere, and then suddenly it did, and you couldn't stop being aware of it. She wasn't going to break the lock. She wasn't going to demand access. She was not that kind of person, and this was not that kind of house, and she'd made an agreement with Silas that was built on something more like mutual respect than most people's arrangements were built on, and she intended to honor it. But she walked past that barn every day, and every day the padlock was there, and every day she thought, what is he keeping? It was on a gray afternoon in late February, with the sky doing that particular thing where it couldn't decide between clearing and collapsing, that she walked the perimeter of the old barn again and found something she'd missed before. On the east side, low near the foundation, where the snow had partially drifted away from the baseboards, there was a gap. Not large. Not a structural problem. The board was intact, just warped by old weather, pulling away from the sill at one corner. The gap was perhaps 2 inches wide and 6 inches long. She crouched down in the snow and looked. She could see the floor inside, a section of it. Plain wood planking, the same heavy cut as the exterior beams, worn smooth in the middle and darker at the edges where light had never reached. And at one edge of what she could see, just barely in the poor light, the corner of something. A rug. Or no, the edge of something sitting on top of a rug. The foot of something large and square, like a box or a chest. She stayed crouched in the snow for a moment, the cold working through her coat and into her knees. Then she stood up, brushed the snow off her skirt, and walked back to the house. She knew it was there now. That was enough for now. The rest would come when it came. That evening at supper, Silas passed her the biscuits, and she took 2, and they talked about the east fence and the price of hay come spring, and whether Cricket was ever going to learn to properly mend a harness, or if that was simply not a skill available to him. It was, by every surface measure, an ordinary evening, but she looked at Silas across the table, at the quiet steadiness of him, the way he listened when she spoke, the way he never once looked at her like she was a problem he was tolerating. And she thought about a man who rode slowly past a window on dark nights and didn't stop, who bought wool in a color she would have chosen herself, who said yes before she'd even finished her proposal, with the certainty of someone who had already made that decision a long time ago. And she thought, whatever is in that barn, it isn't something to be afraid of. She didn't know yet what it was, but she was getting closer. The storm came in from the northwest without much warning, the way the worst ones always did. Evelyn had been watching the sky all morning with the particular attention of someone who'd grown up reading weather the way other people read newspapers, looking at the color of the light, the way the horses were standing in the corral, the direction the crows flew off toward before the clouds even arrived. By midday, she knew it was going to be bad. By early afternoon, the temperature had dropped 8 degrees and the wind was picking up from nothing to something serious in the space of an hour. Silas had ridden out before first light to check the south fence line with Roy. Cricket was somewhere on the property, but she hadn't seen him since breakfast. She was alone in the house when the sky went the color of a bruise and the snow started. Not the soft kind. The other kind. The kind that came in sideways and turned the world to 10 feet of visibility and made everything beyond that theoretical. She fed the stove, checked the water supply, and went through the practical list in her head the way she always did when weather got serious. She had enough for 2 days without going outside. The horses were in the barn. She'd moved Nettie and herself that morning, trusting the sky more than she trusted the forecast. Roy had seen to the cattle before he and Silas left. There was nothing to do but wait. She waited for about 4 hours before she stopped being able to. It wasn't panic. She wasn't built for panic. It was more the specific restlessness of a person who processes difficulty through action and had run out of indoor actions. She'd gone through the pantry inventory twice. She'd organized the kitchen shelf by weight and then alphabetically just to see which system she preferred. She'd sat at the desk and stared at the ledger without actually seeing it. What she kept seeing instead was the gap in the barn wall, the corner of something large and square, sitting on a rug in the dark. She put on every layer she owned, 2 skirts, her heaviest coat, a scarf wound twice around her face, her oldest hat pulled down past her ears, and she opened the back door and stepped into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical thing, not gradual, just immediate and total, the kind of cold that reminded you very quickly that it didn't care about you at all. She put her head down and moved. The main barn was 20 feet from the back door, and she'd done that walk 100 times. She counted the steps now without meaning to. Then past the woodpile, past the second corral fence, which she felt with her hand more than saw. The shape of the old barn came up out of the white in front of her, darker than the snow around it, and she moved along the wall with one hand touching the boards until she reached the door. The padlock was there. She'd known it would be. She stood in front of it with the wind trying to pull her hat off and thought about this for a moment. She was not a person who broke into locked places. She'd built her whole life, in a very real sense, on being the kind of person who could be trusted in other people's spaces. That mattered to her. But the lock itself, she bent to look at it more closely through the snow, was not what she'd expected. It was a good lock, yes, but it was old. The body of it had a particular heaviness that wasn't about security so much as permanence. This wasn't a lock you put on something to keep people out. It was the kind of lock you put on something to keep it safe from weather, from time, from the general indifference of the world. She stood back up and looked at the doorframe. The hinges were on her side. She found a flat stone along the base of the wall, half buried in the snow, and she worked the hinge pins with it, patient, methodical, the way she did everything, until the top one slid up enough to grip, and then the bottom, and then she lifted the door sideways off its hinges and set it against the wall and stepped inside. The cold followed her in, but the wind didn't, and the sudden absence of that sound was so complete that she stood still for a moment, just letting her ears adjust. The barn smelled of old wood and dry air and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. It was dark. The boarded window let in almost nothing, but she'd brought a match tin in her coat pocket and she struck one and held it up. The interior was not what she'd expected. She'd expected equipment, old machinery, broken things, the accumulated debris of a working ranch over a long life. Instead, the space was clean, not empty. There were things stacked along the far wall covered in canvas, but swept clean, maintained clean, the kind of clean that said someone came in here regularly and cared about what was inside. And in the center of the room, on a faded rug that had once been red and was now closer to rust, sat the cedar chest. The match went out. She struck another. The chest was large, maybe 4 feet long, 2 feet high, made of the kind of close-grained cedar that aged to a deep reddish brown. The lid had a lock that matched the padlock outside, old, substantial, permanent. And across the top, burned into the wood in letters that were careful and deliberate without being elegant, was a single word. Her name, Evelyn. She stood with the match burning down toward her fingers and looked at her own name on a chest in a locked barn on a ranch she'd arrived at 3 months ago with nothing but desperation and a proposal. And she felt the floor of her understanding shift again, harder this time, harder than the chamomile or the room or Roy's timeline or any of it. The match burned her fingers. She dropped it and stood in the dark. She found a lantern hanging just inside the door. Of course there was a lantern. Of course it was hung where you could reach it, and lit it and carried it to the chest and crouched down in front of it and put both hands flat on the cedar lid. Her name. Her name had been on this chest long before she had any reason to be in this barn. She could see that from the patina of the letters, the way the wood had oxidized evenly across them, no difference in tone between the burned marks and the surrounding grain. This was not new work. This had been done years ago, half a decade ago at least, maybe more. The chest was locked, but she was here and the chest had her name on it, and she was past the point of being polite about mysteries that were apparently about her. She looked around the barn and found what she needed near the canvas-covered stack, a small iron bar, maybe 18 inches long, the kind used for leverage on stubborn fence posts. She worked the lock with it carefully. She didn't want to destroy the chest. She wanted to open it. There was a difference, and she was precise about it, applying pressure to the hasp rather than the lock body, working steadily, feeling for the give. It gave. The hasp pulled free of the wood, not broken, just released from its screws, which she'd expected. The lid swung up heavily on leather hinges, and the smell of cedar intensified, and Evelyn leaned forward with the lantern. Letters. Dozens of them. stacked in careful order, each one in an envelope sealed but not addressed. She lifted the top one and turned it over. Nothing on the outside. She set the lantern on the floor, sat down cross-legged in front of the open chest with the wind howling outside and the barn holding still around her, and she opened the first envelope. The handwriting was Silas's. She recognized it from the ranch documents, from the margins of the ledgers where he'd made notes. But this was different, slower, more deliberate, like a man who was taking his time because what he was writing mattered more than anything he usually wrote. October, 9 years ago. She read. He didn't open with her name, he didn't open with anything formal at all. He just started the way a person starts talking when they've been quiet too long and have finally found somewhere to put the words. I watched you today at the mill road, helping that woman whose wagon had a broken wheel. You didn't know her. She didn't ask you. You just saw what needed doing and you did it. And when she tried to thank you, you looked like the gratitude embarrassed you more than the work had. I don't know how to explain why I'm writing this down. I just know I don't want to forget it. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she put the letter down and picked up another. The date on this one was 6 months later. You lost your father this winter. I know because Tom Crane told me, and because I saw you in town the following week, and you had the look of someone who has decided not to let people see how badly they are hurting. I know that look. I've worn it myself. I almost spoke to you. I don't know why I didn't. I think I was afraid you'd see right through me, and I wasn't ready for that. She pressed her lips together and reached for the next one. There were letters from the drought year. He'd watched her take in sewing work from 3 different households in town just to keep herself out of debt. Work she was overqualified for, work she did without complaint. There was a letter about the afternoon she'd spent an hour sitting with old Walt Pearson's dog when the animal was sick, just sitting on the step beside it with her hand on its side. There was a letter about the winter she'd given her good coat to a woman who'd arrived in Cutler's Creek with 4 children and nothing adequate for the cold. You told Mrs. Alderman it was an old coat, and you didn't need it, he wrote. It wasn't old. I'd seen you in it 2 weeks before. She set that one down and breathed. The letters weren't romantic in a florid way. They weren't full of declarations. They didn't build toward anything theatrical. They were something quieter and, she thought, more difficult. They were the record of a man paying attention. Sustained, specific, patient attention to a woman he'd never approached, never spoken to, never made any claim on. He hadn't been collecting her. He'd been witnessing her. Writing down the things she did that no one else was writing down. The things she'd done when she thought nobody was watching. She kept reading. An hour in, she found the letter from the spring he'd fixed the guest room. I've been thinking about what I said I would do if the right time ever came. I think the right time might be coming, though I can't say how or when, only that I can feel it the way you feel a change in the weather before the signs are obvious. So I'm going to be ready. I don't know if I'm wrong. I've been wrong before and I'll be wrong again. But I would rather be ready for something that doesn't happen than not be ready for something that does. I fixed the bedroom today, the one that's been empty. I know what she'd want in it. She had to stop. She set the letter down on her knee and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and sat in the cedar-smelling dark with the lantern making its small circle of light. And she did not cry. She had not allowed herself to cry in years, but she sat there in a way that was adjacent to it, close enough to feel it move through her without quite breaking through. 9 years. He had carried this for 9 years without saying a word to her, without placing himself in her path, without asking for anything in return for the watching, for the years of quiet attention, for the room he'd prepared and the tea he'd bought and the window he'd ridden past in the dark. She thought about what it cost a person to want something for 9 years and not take it, not maneuver for it, not push toward it, not arrange things so that it happened the way he wanted it to. Just wait and prepare, and trust that if the day ever came, he would know what to do. She thought about herself on his porch in the frozen dark with her cracked satchel and her $41 and her proposal that was the most humiliating and the most honest thing she'd ever said to another person, and she thought about his yes. Too quick, she'd thought at the time. Too certain. Now she understood. He hadn't needed to think about it because he'd already been thinking about it for 9 years. She hadn't caught him off guard. She'd walked through a door he'd been holding open for longer than she'd known the door existed. She sat in that barn for a long time. The storm was still going outside, but she could hear it battering the boards. But the barn held and the lantern held, and she sat with the letters in her lap, not reading anymore, just holding them. Finally, she put them back. Each one, in order, careful. She closed the lid. She couldn't reattach the hasp without tools she hadn't brought, so she set it as flush as she could and left the iron bar leaning against the chest and carried the lantern to the door. Getting back to the house was harder than getting to the barn. The storm had gotten worse in the hour or more she'd been inside, and the wind was mean now, the kind that pushed back, and she bent into it with her head down and counted her steps and thought about nothing except the next one and the one after that. The back door of the house appeared out of the white exactly when it should have, and she went in and leaned against it from the inside and stood dripping melted snow onto the floor. Her hands were shaking, and she wasn't sure if it was the cold or something else. She was at the stove feeding it more wood when she heard the front door open, the particular sequence of stomping and latch and the rush of cold air, and then the door shutting firmly. Silas. She knew his movements by now without having to look. She heard him hang his hat, heard his boots on the floor, then quiet, which meant he'd seen her coat dripping by the back door and was making a decision about what to say. He came to the kitchen doorway. She turned to look at him. He was snow-covered and cold-cheeked, and he looked at her with that steady brown gaze, and then, very deliberately, he looked at the back door and then back at her. "The old barn," he said. Not a question. "Yes." A long moment. The fire crackled. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "That's all you're going to say?" "What do you want me to say?" She turned back to the stove, not because she had something to do there, but because she needed a moment to decide. "I read them," she said. "Most of them." He didn't answer right away. She heard him move into the kitchen and then stop, and she could feel him standing there behind her with the particular weight of a person who has been waiting a long time for a thing to happen, and now it has, and the waiting is over, and he doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of it. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes, you should have. I know." His voice was quiet. Not apologetic exactly. More like a man saying a plain thing that he'd already made peace with. I didn't know how to explain it without it sounding like something it wasn't. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his coat still on and snow still on his shoulders. And he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the settled stillness she'd come to know, but something underneath that, something that was less resolved, something that was still waiting. "What is it then?" she said. "If it's not what it sounds like." He looked at her for a long moment. "It's just what I noticed," he said. "Written down so I wouldn't lose it. That's all it ever was." She held his gaze. 9 years is a long time to notice something. "Yes," he said. "It is." The kitchen was warm, the storm was loud outside, and between them was the specific silence of two people standing on opposite sides of something that has finally been named, and neither of them knows yet what to do with the naming. Evelyn looked at him, at the snow melting off his shoulders, at the hands she'd watched mend fences and handle animals with the same unhurried care, at the face of a man who had watched her give away her good coat on a cold day and thought it was worth writing down. She didn't say anything else that night, but she didn't look away either. The days after the storm were strange between them. Not bad strange. Not the kind of strange that meant something was broken, but the particular strangeness of a room after the furniture has been rearranged. Everything was still there. It just occupied different space now. They didn't talk about the barn again, not directly, but things had shifted in small ways that both of them could feel and neither of them mentioned. Silas had always been the kind of man who kept a physical distance that wasn't unfriendly but was deliberate. He'd pass her in the kitchen with 6 inches to spare when 4 would have done fine, hand her things at arm's length when he could have just set them on the table. He still did those things, mostly, but occasionally he didn't, and in those moments when the distance collapsed by a few inches, neither of them moved away from it. She caught herself noticing. She didn't like that she noticed. She didn't stop. Roy noticed too, in the way Roy noticed most things, sideways, without comment, while appearing to be focused on something else entirely. He came in one morning for the account ledger she'd been updating and found them both at the kitchen table, not talking, Evelyn with the receipts and Silas with a cup of coffee and a harness he was oiling, and Roy looked at the two of them for exactly 1 second before looking at the ledger and saying, "Got what I need," and going back out. That afternoon, he found a reason to fix something near the back fence that had apparently been fine the day before. Evelyn let herself find it faintly funny, which surprised her. She'd been finding small things funny lately. She wasn't sure what that said about her, but she decided not to investigate it too closely. What she was investigating, with the same methodical focus she brought to everything that mattered, was the rest of the property records. She'd been working through the ranch's legal documentation since the second week. The survey maps, the original land grants, the tax receipts going back 15 years, the water rights filings that covered the creek on the east side of the property. It was the kind of work that required patience and a tolerance for archaic legal language, both of which she had. She'd organized everything into a sequence that made sense, cross-referenced the survey maps against the county records she'd requested from Dylan, and built a complete picture of what Iron Hollow was and what it was worth. It was worth considerably more than she'd understood at first. Not in a way that made Silas rich. She wasn't naive about frontier land economics. But the water rights alone were significant. The creek that ran through the east section wasn't just useful to the Granger Ranch. It was the most reliable water source in a 6-mile radius. Any property that sat downstream depended on what happened to that creek. And the original rights filing, done by Silas's father 30 years ago and renewed twice since, was comprehensive, clear, and completely legal. She'd noted it, filed it, and moved on. She thought about it again the morning Harlan Mercer rode up the lane. She didn't know who he was at first. She saw him from the kitchen window. A man on a big gray horse, well-dressed in the way that people in new money dressed when they wanted you to know about it, with 2 other men riding behind him who had the particular quality of men paid to be present rather than useful. He rode into the yard at the pace of someone who considered himself expected. She went to the door. Silas was already on the porch by the time she got there, which meant he'd seen the riders before she had. He was standing with his hands at his sides, and the particular quality of stillness that she'd come to understand was not calm so much as restraint. The man on the gray horse stopped a few feet from the porch and looked down at Silas with the expression of someone who practices that particular angle of looking. "Granger," he said. "Mercer." Silas's voice was level. Harlan Mercer was maybe 55, heavy-set in the shoulders, with a face that had once been handsome and now was the face of a man who'd spent too many years being agreed with. He had a thick, dark mustache going silver at the edges and pale eyes that moved over everything like he was taking inventory. Those eyes moved to Evelyn. "Your wife," he said, as though confirming a piece of information he'd been given. "Yes," Silas said. "I've heard." Mercer shifted in the saddle. "I'll be brief, Granger. I have a legal claim on the northeast section of this property. 40 acres, running from the stone marker on the ridge down to the creek bend." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Survey says it was never properly annexed to the Granger deed. My attorney filed with the county last week." He held the document out. One of the men behind him moved forward to hand it down. Silas took it and looked at it without unfolding it, which told Evelyn something about what he was feeling. He wasn't ready to look at it yet. "I'd like those acres vacated by the end of the month," Mercer said pleasantly. "There's a fence line to reestablish." "Is there?" Silas said. "The county will back me up. I have documentation." "So do I," Silas said. He folded the document and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll look this over." Mercer looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who'd expected either a fight or a capitulation and gotten neither. "You look it over," he said. "I'll expect a response by Friday." He glanced once more at Evelyn, a glance that managed to be dismissive without crossing into anything she could object to directly, and then he turned the gray horse and rode back down the lane with his 2 hired men behind him. Silas stayed on the porch until they were through the gate. Then he turned and went inside and sat down at the table and took the document out and unfolded it. Evelyn came and stood beside him and looked at it over his shoulder. It was a survey claim filed by an attorney in Helena named Clifford Baines on behalf of Harlan Mercer. The survey it referenced was dated 14 months ago. It argued that a 40-acre section in the northeast corner of Iron Hollow had never been legally incorporated into the Granger deed because of an irregularity in the original 1871 filing. She read it twice. Then she went to the study and came back with the original land grant, the survey maps she'd organized, and the water rights filing. She sat down across from Silas and spread them on the table. "Talk to me about the northeast section," she said. He looked at the maps. "It's been Granger land since my father built the first fence line. He filed it himself." "I know he filed it. I have the filing." She put her finger on the relevant document. "But look at this language here. The 1871 grant uses this creek bend as a boundary marker." She moved her finger to the survey map. "And here's the creek as it runs now. It's not in the same place." He looked at where she was pointing. The creek shifted. Big melt year, maybe 15 years back. Changed the bed about 30 feet east. Right. She sat back. Which means the original boundary marker doesn't exist as described anymore. And if someone resurveyed using the current creek position, they could argue the boundary moved with it. That's what this says. She tapped the Mercer document. It's not a frivolous claim, but it's not airtight either, and I think they know it isn't airtight. I think they're hoping you won't dig into the supporting documents. Silas was looking at the table, not the papers, the table. The way he looked at things when he was thinking. "What would you need?" he said. "Everything, every piece of paper related to that northeast section, going back as far as you have it. Tax receipts that list the acreage, any county correspondence, the water rights renewal filings. Those describe the property boundaries in detail. There's a box in the back room. I need it." He got up and went to the back room, and she heard him moving boxes. And she sat at the table with Harlan Mercer's document in her hands and read it a third time, looking for every assumption it made and every place those assumptions could be tested. She found 4. The box from the back room was a decade of accumulated paper, which was a problem and a resource simultaneously. She spent the first day sorting it, the second day reading it, and the third day beginning to build the counterargument. She worked at the kitchen table because the light was best there. She spread documents across the full surface and moved between them in the precise, unhurried way of someone who understood that getting this right mattered more than getting it done fast. Silas came and went around her. He didn't ask how it was going, didn't hover, didn't offer opinions she hadn't requested. He brought her coffee without being asked, and once, in the late afternoon of the second day, set a plate of food near her elbow and said, "Eat something," and went back outside. She ate something. Cricket came in on the third day looking for Silas and found Evelyn alone at the table surrounded by papers and stopped in the doorway with an expression of mild alarm, as though he'd interrupted something sacred. "He's at the South Corral," she said without looking up. "Right." Cricket didn't move. "Is it bad? The Mercer thing?" She looked up then. Cricket's young face had a particular quality of genuine concern that she'd come to appreciate. He didn't perform emotions, he just had them, visibly, without much filtering. "I'm working on it," she said. "He's been after this ranch for 2 years," Cricket said. "Mercer. Everyone in the valley knows it. He bought up 3 smaller operations last year, Hensley's place and the 2 reared-in parcels. He wants the water." She set her pen down. "Tell me what you know." Cricket leaned against the doorframe, pulling his hat off and turning it in his hands the way he always did when he was thinking. "Mercer's got a big operation east of the ridge. Cattle, mostly, and he's expanding, but his water situation's bad. He's dependent on that one stream that runs dry half the summer. If he gets the northeast corner of this ranch, he gets access to the creek bend. That's year-round water." "I know," she said. "That's why the claim is specifically on those 40 acres and not the center of the property." She picked up the water rights filing and looked at it again. "This is what he actually wants." Cricket nodded. "Roy says Silas will just fight him in court, and that'll take years and cost a fortune." "It won't take years," she said, "and it won't cost what they're expecting it to cost." Cricket looked at her with the expression of someone reassessing a situation. "You found something." "I'm finding things," she said. "Go tell Silas supper will be late tonight." He went. What she found, by the end of the 4th day, was a picture that was considerably cleaner than Harlan Mercer had apparently expected. The water rights renewal filings, done in 1878 and 1884, both described the Iron Hollow property boundaries in detail, including the northeast section. And critically, both filings had been approved and stamped by the county office, with recorded boundary descriptions that matched the original 1871 grant precisely. The county had, twice, on record, acknowledged those 40 acres as Granger land. The survey Mercer was using was commissioned by his own attorney. It had not been filed with the county. It had been presented as evidence without being verified against the existing county record. The second thing she found was more interesting. The 1884 water rights renewal included a handwritten amendment in the margin, initialed by the county clerk and by Silas's father, that explicitly addressed the creek bed shift. It was brief, 3 sentences, but it was there, in the county's own file, noting that the boundary marker was to be understood as fixed at its 1871 position, regardless of subsequent changes in the creek course. Someone, she suspected Silas's father, who had apparently been a more careful man than people gave him credit for, had anticipated exactly this problem 30 years ago and had it noted in the official record. She sat back in her chair and felt the particular satisfaction of finding the thing you were looking for, which was different from happiness and quieter than triumph, but was its own very specific feeling. She took the document to the lamp and read the 3 sentences again. Then she went to find Silas. He was in the barn, as he usually was in the evenings, doing the kind of small maintenance work that kept a ranch from developing large problems. She stood in the barn doorway with the 1884 filing in her hand and waited for him to look up. He looked up. "Your father filed an amendment in 1884, she said. "Creek bed shift." He had it noted in the county record. She held up the document. "The boundary is fixed. Mercer's survey is measuring from a creek position that the county already ruled doesn't change the property line." Silas put down what he was holding and came to look at the document. He read it slowly, then read it again. "He knew," Silas said. Not surprised exactly, more like confirmed. "My father knew someone would try this someday. He was a thorough man. More than I gave him credit for." He handed the document back. His face had the look of something releasing, a tension she'd been watching in him since Mercer rode up the lane, finally loosening its grip. "What do we do with it?" "We take it to the county office in Dillon before Mercer's attorney can file anything further. We present the full record, the original grant, both water rights renewals, the amendment, and we ask the county clerk to issue a written confirmation of the existing boundary." She folded the document carefully. "When Mercer's attorney shows up with his private survey, the county will already have a formal position on record. That's before Friday. We ride tomorrow morning." He looked at her for a long moment. Not with the expression she'd expected, relief or gratitude, or any of the things a person might reasonably feel when their land has been protected. He was looking at her with something more complicated, something that had the weight of everything that had happened since the storm, since the barn, since the chest and the letters and the kitchen doorway where they'd stood in the snow smell and the firelight, and not said the things that needed saying. "Evelyn," he said. She waited. He opened his mouth and then closed it, and she saw him make the decision not to say it yet, whatever it was, with a deliberateness that was very like him, and which she found, to her own surprise, less frustrating than she expected. He had a reason for the timing. He always had reasons. They were just slow ones. "Thank you," he said instead. "It's my job," she said. But she said it without sharpness, because she didn't feel sharpness about it. She'd meant it the day she proposed it on his porch. She had skills, and she intended to use them. But somewhere in the months between that porch and this barn doorway, the meaning of my job had shifted into something that included this place and these people, and possibly, if she was being honest with herself in the dark of her own thoughts, this man. She was still being careful about being honest with herself about that last part. "Get some sleep," she said. "We leave early." The county office in Dillon was run by a meticulous man named Arthur Peel, who wore the same brown vest every time anyone had ever seen him, and kept his files in a system of his own invention that no one else fully understood. He was also, as it turned out, the kind of official who took genuine professional offense at the idea of a private survey being used to contradict a 30-year county record. He read the amendment in the 1884 filing with the focused attention of a man recognizing craftsmanship. "Old Granger," he said, half to himself. "Filed this himself, came in on a Tuesday." He looked up at Silas. "I remember your father. Solid man." "Yes, sir," Silas said. Peel looked at the full package of documents Evelyn had assembled, organized by date, cross-referenced, with a one-page summary she'd written laying out each relevant point in plain language. He read the summary first, which she'd expected, and then went back and read 3 of the documents themselves. "This claim by Mercer's attorney," Peel said. "You say it hasn't been formally filed yet. It's been presented to us informally," Evelyn said. "A verbal notice and a document shown on our property. As far as we know, it hasn't been filed with this office." "It hasn't," Peel said it flatly. "I'd know." He set the papers down and pressed both hands on his desk. "What you're asking for is a written confirmation of existing boundary." "Yes, I can do that. It'll take me 2 days to pull the full county file and cross-reference everything formally, but based on what you've brought me." He tapped the 1884 amendment. "This is about as clear as I've seen. The position is fixed. Any survey that starts from the current creek bed is starting from the wrong place." Evelyn nodded. "We'll wait in Dillon for the written confirmation." 2 days, Peel said again. Then he looked at her over the top of his glasses with the assessing gaze of a man who had seen a great many people come through his office with a great many problems and new competence when it walked in the door. "You put this together yourself?" "Yes." "Where'd you learn to read land filings?" "Necessity," she said. "Mostly." He made a small sound that was the closest thing to approval that a county clerk was apparently permitted to express and went back to his files. They waited 2 days in Dillon. They ate in a small dining establishment off the main street where the food was adequate and the coffee was better than that, and they talked about the ranch and the spring planting and what Roy had said about the south fence that needed a full replacement before summer, and they talked about Cricket's mysterious real name, which Silas finally admitted he actually knew. It was Gerald, which explained everything, and she laughed, which surprised them both a little. She hadn't laughed easily in a long time. It felt like something coming back online after a winter outage. On the second day, Arthur Peel produced a 4-page document that formally confirmed the Iron Hollow boundary as established in the 1871 filing and reaffirmed in both subsequent water rights renewals, with specific reference to the 1884 amendment regarding the creek bed. It was stamped, signed, and registered in the county ledger. She read it 3 times in Peel's office. "That's sufficient," she said. "More than," Peel said dryly. Mercer came back on a Thursday, which was 1 day past his own deadline, and he brought his attorney this time, a thin man from Helena named Clifford Baines, who carried a leather briefcase and had the manner of someone who considered himself the most intelligent person in any given room. Silas met them in the yard. Evelyn stood on the porch. Baines opened with the survey claim in the legal language and the implication that this could become very expensive and very prolonged if the Grangers chose to contest it, and Silas let him finish before he said, "Evelyn." She came off the porch with the county document in her hand and gave it to Silas, who handed it to Baines without comment. Baines read it. His expression didn't change immediately. He had a professional face, practiced at not changing, but she watched his eyes move through the second page, and she saw the precise moment he found the 1884 amendment referenced, because his jaw tightened. He read it through to the end. "The county has confirmed the boundary as established in 1871, Evelyn said from where she stood. "Your survey uses the current creek position as its reference point, which the county explicitly ruled against in 1884. The amendment is in the official record, and the confirmation we received Thursday references it directly." She paused. "Your claim has no legal standing." Baines looked at the document again, as if it might have changed. "Furthermore," she continued, "if this proceeds to any formal legal challenge, we'll be presenting the full documentation to the court, including the sequence of filings, which will make it fairly clear that this claim was filed after a private survey that ignored existing county record. That's not a position I'd want to defend before a judge." Mercer had been quiet through all of this. She looked at him now. He was looking at the document in Baines's hand with the expression of a man recalculating, which was the expression she'd been waiting for. "Clifford," Mercer said. Baines handed him the document. He read it himself. His pale eyes moved through it with the speed of a man who is used to reading legal language quickly, and she watched him arrive at the same place Baines had. "The amendment," he said, mostly to himself. 30 years old, she said, filed by Silas's father. The county clerk in Dillon remembers the filing. A silence that had a particular quality to it, the silence of a position collapsing inward on itself. "We'll need to review this further," Baines said. "You're welcome to," Evelyn said. You know where to find us." Mercer looked at Silas for a long moment. It was the kind of look that said a great deal without saying anything. A man who had been wrong about who he was dealing with, and knew it, and wasn't pleased about it, and wasn't going to admit any of that out loud. "Granger," he said. "Mercer," Silas said. That was the whole of it. Mercer turned his horse, and Baines gathered his briefcase, and they rode back down the lane, and this time they didn't look back. Roy came around the corner of the barn, where he had been, technically, fixing something, and watched them go. "Well?" he said. "Well," Silas agreed. Evelyn was already walking back to the house, because she had things to put away, and the kitchen table was still covered in documents, and there was supper to think about. She was halfway up the porch steps when Silas said her name. She stopped and turned. He was still standing in the yard, and he was looking at her with that expression that had been building since the barn, since the storm, since the kitchen doorway, the one that wasn't settled, the one that was still waiting. "I owe you more than thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the yard, the kind of late winter light that was pale and clear and made everything look more precisely itself than usual. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "This is my home." She heard herself say it and felt it land differently than she'd expected. Her home. She'd said it as a statement of fact, practical, legal, accurate. But standing on those porch steps in that pale light with Silas looking at her from the yard, it sounded like something else too, something she hadn't planned to say yet, and might not have said if she'd been thinking carefully about it. She went inside before she could say anything else. But she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the table and the documents spread around her, and she let herself feel it, the weight of what she'd just said, and what it meant, and how much, without quite deciding to, she had come to mean it. The ranch was quiet around her. The storm had passed. The land was still there, same as it had always been, same 40 acres intact and legal and confirmed in a county ledger in Dillon. And she was still here. That was not a small thing. The word sat with her for days after she'd said it. Home. She turned it over the way you turn over something you've found on the ground, not sure yet if it's worth keeping, not ready to put it down either. She'd had homes before. The house where she grew up, which was gone now. The room at the Fitch place, which had been a shelter more than a home, though she hadn't admitted that to herself until it was taken from her. A person could mistake 4 walls and a roof for belonging if they stayed in one place long enough. This was different, and she knew it was different, and that was precisely what made her careful about it. She was careful about most things that mattered. She'd learned young that the things you reached for too quickly had a way of not being there when your hand arrived. So she went on working. That was what she did with things she wasn't ready to name. She worked alongside them until the shape became clear enough to handle. She organized the spring inventory. She wrote the final letter to the Dillon feed supplier, closing out the dispute account. She began making plans for the workshop she'd been turning over in the back of her mind since early winter. A proper space for the leather and tailoring work she'd been doing at the kitchen table, which was functional but cramped, and which she'd outgrown 3 months ago in terms of the volume of requests coming in from neighboring settlements. The requests had started quietly. Margaret Crane had mentioned to someone that Silas Granger's wife did alterations, that someone mentioned it to someone else. By February, she had enough work to keep her busy on evenings and weekends, and by March she had turned down 2 orders because she simply didn't have the space to take them on. She mentioned it to Silas on a Tuesday evening, not as a request exactly, more as a fact she was reporting. "I need more space than the kitchen table," she said, "for the sewing work." He looked up from the harness he was conditioning. "The old storage room off the back of the barn, south side. I've been using it for feed, but I can move that." She blinked. She wasn't sure what she'd been expecting. A conversation about whether it was practical, whether the demand would last, whether the cost of setting it up made sense. The immediate practical answer was not what she'd braced for. "That's a good space," she said after a moment. "It gets the morning light," he said. "South-facing window." She looked at him. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without ornamentation, as if noting the window's orientation was simply a relevant fact and not evidence that he'd already been thinking about this before she asked. She was beginning to understand that about him. He thought about things a long way in advance of saying anything. He just didn't announce that he was thinking. "I'll need a proper work table," she said, "and shelving." Cricket can build shelving. He's better with wood than he is with harnesses. That's a low bar. It really is. She almost smiled. She turned back to her ledger so he wouldn't see it, but she thought she heard something in the brief silence that followed that suggested he'd noticed anyway. Cricket built the shelving over 4 days in early April, with a focused earnestness that was genuinely touching and an uneven result that was genuinely characteristic. The shelves were solid. She tested each one, but they were not quite level, which Cricket examined from several angles before concluding that the floor was probably the problem. "The floor's fine, Cricket," she said. "It slopes, though." "It doesn't slope." He looked at the shelves, then the floor, then the shelves again. "I'll fix the middle one." "Leave it." She put her hand on the slightly lower end of the middle shelf. "I'll put the heavier spools here. It'll hold better." He accepted this with the relief of a person who had been given an acceptable way to be wrong, and went back to whatever Roy had waiting for him. She stood in the new workshop in the morning light and looked at the shelves and the work table Silas had built himself, without announcement, over 3 evenings. She'd noticed the sawdust outside the barn and the way the table appeared one morning, finished and sanded and set in position without any comment whatsoever. And she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Not contentment exactly. Something more alert than contentment. More like standing on solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing and noticing for the first time that you can feel the difference. The first customer she received in the workshop was a woman from the Halloran settlement, 7 miles west. A Mrs. Dora Halloran who needed 3 dresses let out at the seams and 2 shirts resized for her husband's changed shape after a bad winter. She came in and looked at the space and said, "This is a proper operation." And Evelyn felt an absurd flare of something that was close to pride. She charged fair prices. Not cheap. She'd undervalued her work for years out of the habit of desperation, and she was done with that. But fair. She was good at what she did and getting better, and the quality of the work justified the price. And the people who came to her seemed to understand that because they kept coming back and sending others. By May, she had a waiting list. She told Silas over supper. Not as a boast. She didn't operate that way, but because it was part of the ranch's picture now, part of what Iron Hollow was becoming, and she'd gotten into the habit of keeping him current on the ranch's full situation the way she kept the ledgers current. "A waiting list," he said. 3 weeks out. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was actually processing something rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "Is the space big enough?" "For now. Another year, maybe not." He nodded slowly. "We could build out the back wall of that room. Add maybe 12 feet. She looked at him across the table. "That's a significant build." "Spring is a good time to do it." He picked up his fork again. "If you're staying." The last sentence was said without particular weight or drama, which somehow made it heavier than if he'd announced it formally. She understood immediately what he was actually saying. Not a question about her physical plans, but a question he'd been carrying for months, and was finally setting down on the table between them where they could both look at it. "If you're staying," because she'd come here out of desperation, because the arrangement they'd made at his front door on a frozen morning was a transaction, not a promise. Because nothing that had happened since, not the letters, not the barn, not Mercer's retreat down the lane, not the workshop with its uneven shelves and its south-facing window, none of that had changed the terms of the original agreement, and he knew it. And he had apparently decided this was the way he was going to ask. She set her own fork down. "Silas." He looked at her. "I told you this was my home," she said, "when Mercer rode away. I said it. I know. I don't say things I don't mean. I know that too." He held her gaze. "But you said it in a particular moment. I didn't want to assume it meant more than the moment." She considered him. This man who had watched her from a careful distance for 9 years and never once placed himself in her path, who had carried a cedar chest full of letters about her life and her small acts and her surviving, who had said yes at a door before she'd finished her sentence, and then spent months not asking her to explain what the yes had meant for her, who fixed work tables without saying so, and left the kitchen lamp burning low, and understood that she needed to do things herself before she could accept them being done for her. He had been patient with her in a way that no one had ever been patient with her, and she understood now that it was because he'd had years to practice. She understood something else too, sitting at that kitchen table on a spring evening with the windows finally showing something other than gray and white. She had been waiting for certainty before she let herself feel the thing she'd been feeling for months. Waiting until she was sure enough to risk it. And the problem with that kind of waiting was that certainty about another person was not a thing you arrived at by standing still. It was a thing you earned by moving toward them. "I'm staying," she said, "not because I don't have anywhere else to go. I have somewhere to go. I have $41 and a horse and skills that pay a waiting list, and I could build something elsewhere if I had to." She kept her voice steady, because this mattered enough to say clearly and not have it muddled by emotion she hadn't organized yet. "I'm staying because I want to, because this is where I want to be, because—" She stopped and breathed. "Because I read those letters, Silas. All of them. And I know what you saw when you looked at me all those years. And I think you saw something true. And I would like—" She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I would like to be seen like that for the rest of my life." The kitchen was very quiet. He looked at her with that expression she'd first seen in his doorway on the frozen morning she arrived. That particular brown stillness that wasn't blank, wasn't unreadable, just present. Fully present in a way that some people never manage to be. "There was a last letter," he said. "In the chest. You didn't find it." She frowned slightly. "I went through them all." "It wasn't in the chest." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't write it." She waited. "I started it," he said, "last fall, before you came. I knew, I had a feeling, the kind I'd learned to trust by then, that something was changing, that whatever was going to happen was close." He looked at the table and then back at her. "I got about 3 sentences in, and I couldn't finish it. Because everything I'd written before, I'd written because I didn't think I'd ever say it to you directly. And this one, I thought maybe if the day came, I'd rather say it than write it." She looked at him across the table. The evening light was coming in through the window behind him, the particular quality of spring light in Montana, thin and real and without sentimentality. "The day came," she said. "Yes," he said. "It did." "Then say it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him doing what he always did. Not hesitating, exactly, but making sure of himself before he spoke. Making sure the words were the right ones. He'd had years of practice writing down what he meant, and she'd come to understand that this was a man who took the weight of words seriously, who didn't say things casually and then retract them, who meant what he said with a consistency she had rarely encountered in another person. "I love you," he said. "I have for a long time. Not in a way that wanted something from you. Say, I need you to know that. The letters were never about getting something. They were just—" He exhaled slowly. "The only way I knew to hold on to what I saw, what you were, what you are." He held her gaze. "And I would like to spend whatever time I have left being the person who knows you best. If you'll let me." She sat with that for a moment, not because she was uncertain. She was done being uncertain. She'd been uncertain long enough, and it had served its purpose, and now it was finished. She sat with it because she wanted to actually feel it instead of immediately moving to the next thing, which was her usual response to moments that mattered. She had a habit of managing her way through important things rather than letting them land. She was trying to do it differently. She let it land. "I'm not easy to know," she said finally. "I should tell you that before you commit to it. I work too much, and I think too much. And when I'm worried about something, I don't say so. I just go very quiet and organize things. And that can be—" "I know," he said. "You don't—" "Evelyn." His voice was gentle but certain. "I know." She looked at him. Of course he knew. He'd been watching her manage her way through difficulty for 9 years. He knew exactly what she did when she was worried, and he'd bought her chamomile tea anyway, and left the lamp burning, and built her a work table without saying so. "All right," she said. "All right? I love you too." She said it plainly, the way she said things she meant. "I didn't know when it started, somewhere between the chamomile and the $41, and you building me a table in the dark. I don't know exactly when, but it's there, and it's not going anywhere." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand and held it, and they sat like that in the spring evening light, without saying anything else for a while, because some things don't need more words than they've already been given. Chimti. The cedar chest came out of the barn the following week. Silas carried it himself, which it took some doing. It was heavier than it looked, and she offered to help and he declined, which she let go because there are things a person needs to do themselves, and she understood that as well as anyone. He brought it through the back door and through the kitchen and into the front room, and he set it against the wall beneath the window, and he stepped back and looked at it. She stood in the doorway and looked at it too. It was strange seeing it in the light. In the barn, in the lantern's reach, it had been all mystery and weight. Here in the front room, it was just a chest. Old cedar, well made, with her name burned into the lid in letters that were careful without being elegant. It looked like what it was. A thing a man had made and filled and kept, because he didn't know what else to do with what he felt. "It doesn't need to be here," Silas said. "If you'd rather—" "No." She crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at the chest and thought about everything inside it. "It stays here." "You're sure? It's not a secret anymore," she said. "It shouldn't live in a locked barn." She crouched down and ran her fingers across the letters of her name, the way she'd done in the barn that first time, in the dark with the storm outside. "It's part of what this is, where we are. I don't want to put it away." He crouched down beside her, and they both looked at the chest for a moment. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," he said. "Any of it." "You were afraid." "Yes." "Of what exactly?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. He didn't give her the easy answer. "That it would sound like something it wasn't," he said, "and that you'd leave before I could explain, and that once you knew, you'd feel like you owed me something, or like the choice wasn't really yours. I didn't want it to be. I didn't want you to stay out of obligation." He looked at her. "I wanted you to stay because you wanted to." She held his gaze. "That's why you never interfered," she said. "All those years. You could have spoken to me any number of times. You could have introduced yourself properly. You never did." "No." "Because if you put yourself in my path and I chose you, you'd never know if it was a real choice." He was quiet for a moment. Something like that. She thought about this, about a man who had wanted something for 9 years and deliberately kept himself out of the way of getting it because he needed it to be freely given or not at all. That kind of wanting was rare, the kind that didn't consume or grab, the kind that just held itself still and waited and kept the lamp burning. She stood up. He stood up beside her. "It was a real choice," she said. "I want you to know that. I came to your door because I was desperate and I had nowhere else to go. Everything after that was a choice." He nodded. He believed her. She could see that he believed her, and she was glad, because it was true. Spring moved into summer the way Montana spring always did. Reluctantly, with several false starts, and at least 1 week in late April that felt more like February than May. But eventually the ground softened, and the grass came back, and the creek ran high with the melt, and Iron Hollow woke up from its long white sleep and became, again, something that was alive. Roy and Cricket stayed on, which Evelyn was glad of. Roy because he was simply part of the ranch's fabric. She couldn't imagine the place without him, and she suspected Silas couldn't either. Cricket because he was learning slowly, and because he told her once in a serious moment, when he thought she might not entirely be listening, that he didn't really have anywhere else he was supposed to be. She'd heard that. She understood it. The workshop expanded in June. Silas and Roy and a carpenter from Dillon spent 10 days on the back wall, and when it was finished there was nearly double the space, and she stood in the middle of it on the first morning after they were done and turned in a slow circle and thought, "Yes, this is enough. This is exactly enough." The work grew with the space. By late summer she had taken on a young woman from the Halloran settlement, a girl of 17 named Bess, who had steady hands and a good eye and who learned faster than anyone Evelyn had ever taught. She paid Bess fairly and expected her to show up on time and do the work properly, and had no patience for shortcuts. And Bess responded to this as though it were a gift, which perhaps it was. She'd been treated as incapable before. Being treated as capable made her become it. The town shifted as towns do when they have no other choice. Patricia Holt did not apologize. Evelyn did not expect her to and would not have known what to do with it if she had. But the conversation stopped, the whispered kind, the plausibly deniable kind. And that was sufficient. What replaced it wasn't warmth exactly, but a certain grudging acknowledgement that this woman at the Granger Ranch was someone you dealt with honestly because she dealt honestly back. And she had a long memory and accurate ledgers, and there wasn't much percentage in starting something with her. That was enough. It was more than she'd had before. Margaret Crane came by every few weeks and brought things and accepted coffee and talked in her direct, unsentimental way about the valley and the people in it, and she and Evelyn had developed the particular friendship of two women who said what they meant and didn't require the other to perform more feeling than they had. It was the kind of friendship that held up under practical circumstances, which was the kind that lasted. One afternoon in late summer, Margaret sat at Evelyn's kitchen table with her coffee and looked at the cedar chest under the front room window and said, "What's that?" Evelyn told her. Not everything. Some of it was not hers to tell, and some of it was too private to share even with someone she trusted. But the shape of it. A man who had kept a long, quiet attention. Letters written and never sent. A chest with a name on it. Margaret was quiet for a moment after she finished. 9 years, Margaret said. About that. And he never said a word. Not until I found it. Margaret looked at her coffee. She had the expression of a woman revising something. I misjudged him, she said simply. Most people did, Evelyn said. He doesn't make it easy to understand him. Do you? Understand him? Evelyn considered. Better than I did. Not completely. She picked up her own cup. I don't think that part is ever really finished. Margaret nodded slowly. No, she said. I don't think it is. Then, the evening she remembered afterward, the one that stayed with her the way certain evenings do, not because something dramatic happened, but because everything that needed to be true was true at the same time, was an ordinary one in the first week of September. Supper was finished and the dishes were done and the light outside was doing the specific thing it did in early fall in the valley, going from gold to amber to the particular deep blue of a clear evening without clouds. She was sitting on the porch steps with a length of leather in her lap that she was stitching for a client's saddlebag, and Silas was in the yard doing something with a fence post that had been listing for a week, and from inside the barn she could hear Cricket talking to one of the horses in the one-sided, confiding way he had, which she'd stopped finding strange and now found just characteristic. She heard Roy somewhere further out, the distant sound of something being hammered. The evening smelled of turned earth and wood smoke, and the particular clean smell that comes after a clear day in high country. Silas straightened up from the fence post and looked at it, and then looked at her. It's holding, he said. Good, she said. He came and sat on his porch step beside her, a few inches away. The usual distance between them that had settled into something natural and comfortable, and that meant something different than it had in the beginning. She was aware of him beside her with the particular awareness of a person you know well and have chosen and will go on choosing. She kept stitching. He looked at the yard and the fence and the evening sky, and she looked at the leather in her hands, and neither of them said anything, and it was the right kind of not saying anything, the kind that had room in it, that was comfortable in its own skin, that didn't need to be filled. She thought about the woman who had ridden to this porch on a frozen morning with nothing but a cracked satchel and a proposal, and the particular dignity of someone who was going to go down honest rather than compromise that last thing about herself. She thought about what that woman had expected. A transaction, a roof, a way through the winter. Something temporary. Something provisional. She had not expected this. She thought it was probably worth saying, so she said it. I didn't think it would be like this, she said. Not to start a conversation. Just to say a true thing. Silas looked at her. Like what? She thought about how to answer. Like something I built, she said finally. I think I thought, whatever happened, it would be something I survived, the way I survived everything else. She kept her eyes on the stitching for a moment. This doesn't feel like surviving. He was quiet for a moment. What does it feel like? She looked up and looked at the yard, at the fence holding, at the barn with its light on, at the evening coming down over the valley with its long patience, and she thought about Roy and Cricket and Margaret Crane and Bess with her steady hands, and the workshop with its uneven shelves and its south-facing window, and the cedar chest under the front room window with her name burned into the lid, and the man beside her who had kept a 9-year silence out of respect for her right to choose. "Like something I picked," she said. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She went back to her stitching. He stayed where he was. The evening came down around them both, unhurried, and the valley held them the way it held everything, without preference, without promise, without any guarantee at all. Just the land and the light going, and two people sitting in the particular piece of a life that had been hard-earned and was therefore real. That was what she had learned, in the end. Not a lesson she could have been told in advance, the kind that only makes sense after you've lived the length of it. That the things worth having were almost never the things you arrived at easily. That a person who had been invisible for long enough sometimes couldn't feel themselves being seen, even when someone had been seeing them for years. That desperation and love were not opposites. Sometimes desperation was just the last door you had to go through to get somewhere worth being. And that home was not a place you were given. It was a place you chose and kept choosing every ordinary evening until the choosing became who you were. She finished the seam and held it up to the last light to check the tension. It was good work. She folded it and set it on the step beside her. Silas was still there. She leaned slightly, just slightly, the smallest shift of weight, and her shoulder found his. He didn't move away. Neither did she. The last light left the valley, and the stars came out over Iron Hollow, and they sat there together in the dark that was not frightening at all.